Writing about literature. Arguing about poems. Lecturer, Sami Babash. Source, John Schilb. And John Clifford. A Brief Guide to Arguing About Literature, 2nd edition. Thank you for your attendance. Don't forget to like and share the video. Hit the subscribe button and the notification bell for more content to come. Arguing about poems. Some students are put off by poetry, perhaps because their early experiences with it were discouraging. They imagine that poems have deep hidden meanings they can't uncover. Maybe their high school English teacher always had the right interpretation, and they rarely did. This need not be the case. Poetry can be accessible to all readers. The problem is often a confusion about the nature of poetry, since poetry is more compressed than prose. Poetry focuses more on connotative, emotional, or associative meanings and conveys meaning more through suggestion, interaction, and the use of metaphor, symbol, and imagery than prose does. It seldom hands us a specific meaning. Poetic texts suggest certain possibilities, but the reader completes the transaction. Part of the meaning comes from the writer, part from the text itself, and part from the reader. Even students who are the same age, race, religion, and ethnicity are not duplicates of one another. Each has unique experiences, family histories, and emotional lives. If 30 people read a poem about conformity or responsibility, all 30 will have varying views about these concepts, even though they will probably have some commonalities. Most societies are so saturated with shared cultural experiences that it is nearly impossible to avoid some overlap in responses. In a good class discussion, then, we should be aware that even though we might be members of the same culture, each of us reads from a unique perspective, a perspective that might also shift from time to time. If a woman reads a poem about childbirth, her identity as a female will seem more relevant than if she were reading a poem about death, a more universal experience. In other words, how we read a poem and how significant and meaningful the poem is for us depends both on the content of the poem and on our specific circumstances. Suppose you were 14 when you first read a poem about dating. You would likely have very different responses rereading it at 19, 25, and 50. We read poems through our experiences. As we gain new experiences, our readings change. One reason to respond in writing to your first reading is to be able to separate your first thoughts from those of your classmates. They too will bring their own experiences, values, and ideas to the discussion. In the give and take of open discussion, it may be difficult to remember what you first said. Of course, the point of a classroom discussion is not simply to defend your initial response, for then you would be denying yourself the benefit of other people's ideas. A good discussion should open up the poem, allow you to see it from multiple viewpoints, and enable you to expand your perspective, to see how others make sense of the world. This rich mixture of the poet's text, the reader's response, and discussion among several readers can create new possibilities of meaning. Even more than fiction or drama, poetry encourages creative readings that can be simultaneously true to the text and to the reader. A lively class discussion can uncover a dozen or more plausible interpretations of a poem, each backed up with valid evidence from both the poem and the reader's experience. You may try to persuade others that your views about the poem are correct. Others may do the same to you. This negotiation is at the heart of a liberal, democratic education. In fact, maybe the most respected and repeated notion about being well educated is the ability to empathize with another's point of view, to see as another sees. Reading, discussing, and writing about poetry can help you become a person who can both create meaning and understand and appreciate how others do. This is one important way literature matters. 1. Reading Wordsworth's poem. Wordsworth was Poet Laureate of England, and he continues to be regarded as a major British Romantic poet. He and fellow poet Samuel Taylor Coleridge collaborated on Lyrical Ballads, a collection of verse that became a landmark of Romantic poetry. In his preface to the 2nd edition 2 years later, Wordsworth famously defined poetry as emotion recollected in tranquility, contended that it should draw on common life, and called for it to incorporate language really used by men. Like many other romantics, Wordsworth celebrated scenes of nature and country life while deploring the increasing spread of cities. The Solitary Reaper appeared in his 1807 poems in 2 volumes. Before examining a student writer Abby's writing process, let's read Wordsworth's poem. William Wordsworth. The Solitary Reaper. Behold her, single in the field, yon solitary Highland lass, reaping and singing by herself. Stop here, or gently pass. Alone she cuts and binds the grain, and sings a melancholy strain. Oh listen, for the vale profound, is overflowing with the sound. No nightingale did ever chaunt more welcome notes to weary bands of travellers in some shady haunt among Arabian sands. A voice so thrilling ne'er was heard in springtime from the cuckoo bird, breaking the silence of the seas. Among the farthest Hebrides, will no one tell me what she sings? Perhaps the plaintive numbers flow for old, unhappy, far-off things, and battles long ago, or is it some more humble lay, familiar matter of today? Some natural sorrow, loss, or pain, that has been, and may be again. Hate single quote the other theme, the maiden sang, as if a song could have no ending. I saw her singing at her work, and o'er the sickle bending. I listened, motionless and still, and, as I mounted up the hill, the music in my heart I bore, long after it was heard no more. Step 1. Exploring the poem. Exploring, the first stage of writing an essay about literature, is this particular process of reading. It specifically involves the following: making predictions as you read, rereading the text with a different focus each time, including at least one stage in which you read aloud, comparing the text with your personal experience, tracing patterns and breaks from these patterns, noting ambiguities, considering the author's alternatives, generating questions, considering how the text deals with topics that have preoccupied literary studies, formulating a tentative claim, using informal writing to move through all these steps, including commenting in the text's margins, note-taking, free writing, creating a dialectical notebook, and playfully revising the text. Exploring the poem. Abby, the student writer, did at least 10 minutes of free writing about Wordsworth's poem, keeping it nearby so that she can consult it if she needed to. In particular, she tried to raise questions about the poem, and consider which of these may be worth addressing in a more formal paper. Here is an excerpt from Abby's free writing. I see that this poem consists of 4 stanzas, each of which is 8 lines long. But these stanzas have different emphasis. The first stanza is a series of commands. The speaker tells people to behold, stop here, or gently pass, and listen. The second stanza mainly describes the reaper. The third stanza is basically a bunch of questions. The fourth is the speaker's recollection of his experience in general. So, I could write a paper about how this poem changes as it moves along and why the stanzas shift in emphasis. But one problem with a paper like that is that it might get me bogged down in mechanically moving from stanza to stanza. I don't want that to happen. Another thing I could do is answer one of the speaker's own questions, which are about what kind of song the reaper is singing. Evidently this Highland lass is using a Scottish dialect that he doesn't understand. But I'm just as ignorant as he is about the song. I guess I'm more likely to contribute some analysis of my own if I come up with a question myself. I'm struck by the fact that he doesn't give us much sense of the reaper's song. There's no way that a printed poem could convey the reaper's tune, but still. And the words are foreign to the speaker. But I'm surprised that he doesn't make a little effort to convey at least some of the song's lyrics, even if they're foreign words that he might hear wrong or misspell. How can I as a reader join him in experiencing the beauty of her song if I don't learn any of its words? I wonder if we're supposed to see the poem as being more about the speaker than about the reaper. More specifically, maybe we're supposed to be a little disturbed that he's a British intellectual who is making a spectacle out of a foreign woman from the working class. At any rate, he seems bent on controlling this experience even as he invites us to share it. Another question for me is, why does he shift from present tense to past tense in the last stanza? This change is really curious to me. I don't see anything earlier on that prepares me for it. First, we're led to believe that the speaker is observing the reaper right then and there, but at the end he speaks as if this occurred in the past, though maybe the recent past. This inconsistency in the time frame makes me think that in some important way the overall poem is about time. At any rate, I'm drawn to the inconsistency because it's so blatant. If I wrote about it, I might still devote a paragraph to each stanza, but I'd be starting with the last one and referring back to the others in order to explain that stanza. What I still have to figure out, though, is what exactly the poem is saying about time when it makes the shift of tense. Free writing enabled Abby to raise several questions. At the same time, she realized that her paper could not deal with everything that puzzled her. When you first get an assignment like hers, you may fear that you will have nothing to say. But you will come up with a lot of material if, like Abby, you take time for exploration. As we have suggested, it's a process of examining potential subjects through writing, discussion, and just plain thinking. One of your challenges will be to choose among the various issues you have formulated. At the end of this excerpt from her free writing, Abby is on the verge of choosing to analyze the poem's shift of tense in its final stanza. For her, this shift is an interesting change from a pattern, the poem's previous uses of present tense. Abby has not yet decided how to explain this shift. At the moment, it remains for her a mystery. But her paper would achieve little if it focused just on aspects of the poem that are easy to interpret. Though Abby has more thinking to do about the poem's shift of tense, it seems a promising subject for her precisely because it puzzles her. Step 2, the major claim or thesis. Planning for an assignment like Abby's involves 5 main activities. 1. Choosing the text you will analyze. 2. Identifying your audience. 3. Identifying the main issue, claim, and evidence you will present. 4. Identifying your assumptions. 5. Determining how you will organize your argument, including how you will demonstrate your process of reasoning. So, what should we conclude from the inconsistency in pattern that occurs when the final stanza shifts to past tense? After much thought, she expressed her main claim this way: one possible justification for the shift to past tense is that it reminds us of the speaker's inability to halt the passage of time. He would like to freeze his encounter with the reaper, keeping it always in the present. But as the shift in tense indicates, time goes on, making the encounter part of the speaker's past. Perhaps, therefore, the poem's real subject is the idea that time is always in flux. Audiences usually want evidence, and as we noted earlier, most arguments you write about literature will need to cite details of the work itself. Because direct quotation is usually an effective move, Abby planned to elaborate her claim by citing several of Wordsworth's references to time. Remember, though, that you need to avoid seeming willfully selective when you quote. While Abby expected to quote from Wordsworth's last stanza, she also knew she had to relate it to earlier lines so that her readers would see her as illuminating the basic subject of the whole poem. In particular, she looked for language in the first 3 stanzas that might hint at the speaker's lack of control over time, thereby previewing the last stanza's emphasis. Step 3. Identify your assumptions. Often, to think about particular challenges of your paper is to think about your assumptions. Remember that a big category of assumptions is warrants. These are what lead you to call certain things evidence for your claims. Abby knew that one of her warrants was an assumption about Wordsworth himself, that he was not being sloppy when he shifted tenses in his last stanza. Rarely will your paper need to admit all the warrants on which it relies. Most of the time, your task will be to guess which warrants your readers do want stated. Abby felt there was at least one warrant she would have to spell out, her belief that the poem's verb tenses reveal something about the speaker's state of mind. Step 4. Determine your organization. To make sure their texts seem organized and demonstrate the process of reasoning, most writers first do an outline, a list of their key points in the order they will appear. Outlines are indeed a good idea, but bear in mind that there are various kinds. Outline type number 1, one popular type, which you may already know, is the sentence outline. As the name implies, it lists the writer's key points in sentence form. Its advantages are obvious. This kind of outline forces you to develop a detailed picture of your argument's major steps, and it leaves you with sentences you can then incorporate into your paper. Unfortunately, sentence outlines tend to discourage flexibility. Because they demand much thought and energy, you may hesitate to revise them, even if you come to feel your paper would work better with a new structure. Outline type number 2. A second, equally familiar outline is the topic outline, a list in which the writer uses a few words to signify the main subjects that he or she will discuss. Because it is sketchy, this kind of outline allows writers to go back and change plans if necessary. Nevertheless, a topic outline may fail to provide all the guidance a writer needs. Outline type number 3. We find the third type useful, a rhetorical purpose outline. As with the first 2, you list the major sections of your paper. Next, you briefly indicate 2 things for each section: the effect you want it to have on your audience and how you will achieve that effect. Here is the rhetorical purpose outline that Abby devised for her paper. First paragraph, introduction. The audience needs to know the text I'll discuss. I'll identify Wordsworth's poem. The audience must know my main issue. I'll point out that the poem is puzzling in its shift of tenses at the end. The audience must know my main claim. I'll argue that the shift to past tense suggests that the poem's real subject is the inability of human beings to halt the passage of time. Second paragraph, analysis of the poem's final stanza. The audience needs to see in detail how the final stanzas shift to past tense signals the speaker's inability to control the passage of time. I will point out not only the shift of tense, but also other words in the last stanza that imply time moves on. I will note as well that music is an especially fleeting medium, so the Reaper's song was bound to fade. Third paragraph, analysis of the preceding stanzas. To accept that the passage of time is the poem's real concern, the audience must see that the preceding stanzas hint at this subject. I will analyze the first 3 stanzas in turn, showing how each implies the speaker is frustrated over his inability to control time. Fourth paragraph, conclusion. The audience may need to be clearer about what I consider the ultimate tone of the poem. I will say that although the poem can be thought of as a warm tribute to the singing reaper, the final emphasis on the passage of time is pessimistic in tone, and the speaker winds up as solitary as the reaper. This was Abby's outline. For your own rhetorical purpose outlines, you may want to use phrases rather than sentences. If you do use sentences, as Abby did, you do not have to write all that many. Note that Abby wrote relatively few as she stated the effects she would aim for and her strategies for achieving those effects. Thus, she was not tremendously invested in preserving her original outline. She felt free to change it if it failed to prove helpful. Step 5. Decide on a title. You may be inclined to let your title be the same as that of the text you discuss. Were you to write about Wordsworth's poem, then, you would be calling your own paper The Solitary Reaper. But often such mimicry backfires. For one thing, it may lead your readers to think that you are unoriginal and perhaps even lazy. Also, you risk confusing your audience, since your paper would actually be about Wordsworth's poem rather than being the poem itself. So, take the time to come up with a title of your own. Certainly, it may announce the text you will focus on, but let it do more. In particular, use your title to indicate the main claim you will be making. With just a few words, you can preview the argument to come. Step 6. Make choices about your style. Arguments about literature are most compelling when supported by quotations, but be careful not to quote excessively. If you constantly repeat other people's words, providing few of your own, your readers will hardly get a sense of you as an author. Moreover, a paper full of quotation marks is hard to read. Make sure to quote selectively, remembering that sometimes you can simply paraphrase. When you do quote, try to cite only the words you need. You do not have to reproduce a whole line or sentence if one word is enough to support your point. When summarizing what happens in a literary work, be careful not to shift tenses as you go along. Your reader may be confused if you shift back and forth between past and present. We suggest that you stick primarily to the present tense, which is the tense that literary critics customarily employ. For example, instead of saying that the speaker praised the lass, say that he praises her. Step 7. Recognize and avoid logical fallacies. Although literary texts are often not logical by themselves, your arguments about these texts should be. The kinds of serious arguments you are expected to create cannot be successful using heartfelt emotion alone. When you write about literature, shaky thinking might cause your audience to dismiss your ideas. Your claims and the assumptions behind them should be clear and reasoned. If they are not, you might be committing a fallacy, a common term for unsound reasoning. Fallacy type 1, one of the most common fallacies, ad hominem, is probably the easiest to commit because it is the hardest to resist. Instead of doing the hard work of analyzing the claim and the evidence, we simply ignore them and attack the character of the person making the argument. Instead of trying to figure out what is going on in a complex work of literature, we say, how can you take seriously a poem about love written by a manic depressive who commits suicide? It is best to focus on the message, not the messenger. Writing about literature. Arguing about poems. Lecturer, Sami Babash. Source, John's Chilb. And John Clifford. A Brief Guide to Arguing About Literature, 2nd edition. Thank you for your attendance. Don't forget to like and share the video. Hit the subscribe button and the notification bell for more content to come.